Deciding to review this movie was a lengthy process for me, because at first I simply didn't know how I was going to do it. Reviewing Blade Runner presents three crucial problems. The first is that the film has an odd quality to it that no other film I can think of off the top of my head has. Blade Runner contains twice as many ideas it explores as it does actions on screen. I therefore run the risk of talking more about those ideas in the movie than I do the movie itself, which may be interpreted as being only half of a movie review. I'm willing to run that risk because as this movie is primarily about its ideas, I think it is appropriate to discuss them as much as the movie presents them. So before I go any further, I want to warn everyone that this might be the most indulgent movie review I have ever done. I will be talking just as much, if not sometimes more, about the subjects the movie raises as I do the movie itself. Now, this may seem like a complete 360 from the rules I usually follow when doing a review, but this is almost the point of why I wanted to review Blade Runner in the first place. If you ever wanted an example of where I feel interpretation and audience analysis works, it's right here. The actions on screen problem, however, present me with the second problem. As I've said elsewhere, Blade Runner has another interesting quirk to it. Quite frankly, it's boring. Or to use what I think is a more accurate term, it's slow. Gene Siskel generously described the pace of this film as leisurely. Now, this is not a problem with the movie itself, however, only with an attempt to review the movie. There are a million reasons why a film is boring or slow. In the case of 2001, a supposedly cerebral film, the film is boring because it has only fancy-looking images on screen and no ideas. In the case of Kill Bill Volume 2, a supposedly action-packed film, the film is boring because it promises action and gives us nothing of the sort. This film inherits this handicap on the most technical and basic of all levels. Blade Runner is boring simply because it contains little to no action. This is not a problem, as what it lacks in action it more than makes up for in ideas and impeccable storytelling. The problem is when you try and review a movie that has almost nothing physically happening at any given time. Because this discussion must center on an investigation of its ideas and almost never to what's physically happening on screen, I run the risk of making this more like a lecture than a movie review. But again, I'm willing to take that risk because, quite frankly, I love this movie and the ideas that it presents, so I am willing to proceed and hope that it all works out in the end. Which only left me with one final problem. Which cut to use. This film has one final interesting quirk, and that is that it has two different versions of itself that have been circulated that are equally well known among its fan base. In fact, those versions have themselves had different variations since the movie's release, but they basically fall into the narration and non-narration versions. Some believe that the theatrical release is the one to watch. Most seem to believe that the director's cut is the superior version. Me? I'm with Roger Ebert on this one.
So, okay, what's new in this version of Blade Runner? Well, it's more a case of what Scott left out than what he put in. The earlier version had a spoken narration by Harrison Ford, which was included because the studio was afraid the public wouldn't understand the movie. That narration is gone, and the movie now ends on a more existential note with dialogue of sad irony rather than with a more conventional action climax. But this version has the same basic strengths and weaknesses of the 1982 release. I think that basically it's a wash. It's just another version of more or less the same material, and you can look at it again and see if you like it better or not.
Personally, I believe that the director's cut is slightly better, but that both versions have positives and negatives. Removing the campy narration takes away from that noir feel of the film, but at the same time, that narration usually gave us information that we could easily have figured out ourselves. But the biggest reason I prefer the director's cut is that I have never liked the slapped-on, feel-good ending of the original version, and I think that the movie plays better with the director's cut ending. I will be using the director's cut for this review, but as for which version I recommend, again, I'm with Ebert on this one. I recommend both. Watch them both, and decide for yourselves which one you prefer. So with all these things in mind, we now begin the review. The film begins with a written exposition of the situation. Early into the 21st century, the Tyrell Corporation advanced robot evolution into the Nexus phase, which created robots that were virtually identical to human beings. These beings were known as replicants. Their physical attributes, such as strength and speed, were superior to humans, but their intellect was, at best, on the exact same level to the human beings who created them. These replicants were used as slave labor for off-world work in the hazardous exploration and colonization of other worlds, until one day, on an off-world colony, the replicants revolted. After this, replicants were declared illegal on Earth under penalty of death, and special police squads known as Blade Runners were assigned to track them down and kill any trespassing replicant. And the final opening credits states that this was not called execution, it was called retirement. The scrolling titles in the opening give us a crucial piece of insight, one that ties in directly to the philosophy of the mind that inspired this film. That being that replicants were superior in every physical way, but only comparable in intelligence. The ideas in Blade Runner revolve around the thinking of two historical individuals. The first is the French philosopher René Descartes. The second is the computer scientist Alan Turing, who was more of a philosopher, and a brilliant one at that, than I think even he ever realized. Since before computers were even invented, the great thinkers of our world attempted to answer the question of whether or not machines would ever be invented that could do the thinking of a human being. Almost all of them, including Descartes, said no. Today, even with all of our advanced technologies, even the most optimistic computer and AI scientists concede that computers cannot, as of yet, do the thinking of a human being. That isn't to say that computers cannot think, mind you. If you pose the question of whether or not a human being, an animal, and a computer can all think, the answer is going to be yes in some respects, and no in others. A truly thinking computer is still a real possibility, but, for the time being, limited to the works of fiction. But there is an obvious question raised in what was just said. How would we know if a machine can do the thinking of a human being or not? What distinguishes human thought from any other kind of thought? What do we look for when identifying human thought? Alan Turing presented perhaps the most compelling answer to that question. For him, the answer could be found in a simple everyday conversation. Turing got the idea from, of all things, a party game known as the imitation game, in which a man and a woman would go behind a screen and attempt to fool the guests into believing that they are the other participant, a man, not a woman, and vice versa. The guests would give them written questions in an attempt to determine their gender, and the participants would respond in an attempt to deceive them. Alan Turing took that idea and posed the following question. What will happen when a machine takes the part of A in this game? Will the interrogator decide wrongly as often when the game is played like this as he does when the game is played between a man and a woman? These questions replace our original, can machines think? Turing envisioned a test involving one human, one machine, and a judge. The judge could ask both participants as many questions as he liked, and the participants could respond any way they liked. They could lie to him, change the nature of the conversation, all in an attempt to deceive the judge. If the judge could not tell the difference between the man and the machine, we could justifiably conclude, at least beyond a reasonable doubt, that the machine is capable of doing the thinking of a human being. And what an insight that was, for it put the answer in entirely human terms. The clues to be looked for in identifying human thought were not some great act of superior calculation or feats of strength or speed, but in a regular, ordinary conversation. Calculations can be programmed. Conversations cannot. A human conversation is different from all other forms of communication. There is no set predictable path that it will go. You could begin a conversation talking about the new Star Trek movie and end up talking about Barack Obama's healthcare policy. You simply never know. But it is the kind of thinking that exists outside the parameters of computer thinking, at least at the present moment. The original concept of the Turing test was to have one human and one computer separated by a screen with all the answers given in printout. But this was only necessary because computers of the time could not have voices or physical forms. Remove that problem, and the screen and printout would become unnecessary. Therefore, the crux of the test is this. If you could have a conversation with a machine, and by the end of that conversation you could not tell if you had been talking to a machine or a human being, then we would be justified in concluding, at least beyond a reasonable doubt, that the machine can do the thinking of a human being. If you have ever tried to have a conversation with an automated system over the phone, only to continually mash that key that corresponds to "speak to a live representative," then you will understand how far away we are from a computer that can do the thinking of a human being by the standards of this test. So with that in mind, our first scene in the film shows a replicant being subject to a test. He is asked a series of questions designed to provoke an emotional response that will apparently distinguish him from a human being. This is known in the Blade Runner universe as the Voight-Kampff test. Amazingly, many Blade Runner fans who are also familiar with philosophy of the mind and with the history of thought regarding AI have declared that this test is a version of the Turing test. When not only is this not the Turing test, but it is in fact the antithesis of what the Turing test was designed to do, a fact that will solidify precisely what this movie is really about. We'll go more into detail in that in a later scene, but for now, keeping in mind everything that has been said about the Turing test, consider the following scene.
Okay, if I talk? I get kind of nervous when I take tests.
Just please don't move.
Oh, sorry. I already had an IQ test this year. I don't think I've ever had one of
Reaction
these.
time is a factor in this, so please pay attention. Now answer as quickly as you can.
Sure.
1187 at Hunterwasser.
That's the hotel.
What?
Where I live.
Nice place?
Yeah, sure, I guess. Is that part of the test?
No. Just warming you up, that's all.
It's not fancy or anything.
You're in a desert, walking along in the sand when all of a
Is
sudden...
this the test now?
Yes, you're in a desert, walking along in the sand when all of a sudden you look
What one?
down... What?
What desert?
Doesn't make any difference what desert. Is completely hypothetical.
But how come I'd be there?
Maybe you're fed up. Maybe you want to be by yourself. Who knows? You look down and you see a tortoise, Leon. It's crawling towards
Tortoise? What's that?
you. You know what a turtle is?
Of course.
Same thing.
I've never seen a turtle. But I understand what you mean.
You reach down, you flip the tortoise over on its back, Leon.
Do you make up these questions, Mr. Holden? Or do they write them down for you?
The tortoise lays on its back, its belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs, trying to turn itself over, but it can't. Not without your help. But you're not helping.
What do you mean I'm not helping?
I mean you're not helping. Why is that, Leon?
This man has just passed the Turing test. He passed it with flying colors, and he passed it before the Voight-Kampff test ever began. Unfortunately for the questionnaire, Leon simply ends up shooting him to death, and we cut to our main protagonist, Deckard, who is trying to have lunch when a few police officers whisk him away to his former employer. Deckard is a retired Blade Runner who apparently quit a while back. However, his former employer informs him of 4 replicants who recently killed 23 people off-world and jumped a shuttle. He wants Deckard back on the case because he is apparently the best of his profession. With a lot of arm twisting, Deckard agrees, and the details are explained to him. The replicants were apparently attempting to infiltrate the Tyrell Corporation. On the suspicion that they might also try to infiltrate the working ranks, Deckard's former boss ordered Voight-Kampff tests for all of Tyrell's employees, which is how Leon was eventually fleshed out. He briefs Deckard on all of the replicants that they are aware of, including Leon.
They were designed to copy human beings in every way except their emotions. And the designers reckoned that after a few years, they might develop their own emotional responses. Hate, love, fear, anger, envy. So they built in a fail-safe device.
Which is what?
4-year lifespan. Now, there's a Nexus 6 over at the Tyrell Corporation. I want you to go put the machine on it.
And if the machine doesn't work?
Deckard makes his way to see Tyrell himself, and upon his arrival, he is introduced to Rachel. We are then introduced to Tyrell, who explains precisely what is involved in the test Deckard has come here to run. Now, pay close attention to this description, as it will once again shed a great deal of light on what is really going on in this world.
Capillary dilation of the so-called blush response, fluctuation of the pupil, involuntary dilation of the iris.
We call it Voight-Kampff for short.
Mr. Deckard, Dr. Eldon Tyrell.
Demonstrated. I want to see it work.
Where's the subject?
I want to see it work on a person. I want to see a negative before I provide you with a positive.
What's that going to prove?
Indulge me.
On you?
Try her.
Deckard proceeds with the void comp test on Rachel. The same basic questions are asked as with Leon, scenarios that involve severe emotional responses of fear, anger, embarrassment, and the like. When the test is complete, Deckard has his answer.
She's a replicant, isn't she?
I'm impressed. How many questions does it usually take to spot one?
I don't get it, Tyrell.
How many questions?
20, 30 cross-referenced.
It took more than 100 for Rachel, didn't it?
She doesn't know.
She's beginning to suspect, I think.
Suspect? How can it not know what it is?
Deckard's reaction is precisely why this is not the Turing test. Any average person who shared Deckard and Rachel's first conversation would never be able to distinguish Rachel from a normal human being. Only by micro-investigating every tiny nuance can anyone in this world make that distinction. The void comp test is a test designed to split hairs, not to make an impartial determination. Whereas the Turing test is designed to impartially determine what the machine is, the void comp test is specifically designed to determine what it is not. In the words of Roger Ebert, the replicants are people in every way except one. Someone is telling them they are not. This test in this world has been designed to suit the ends of the people who created it, in order to give them the answer that they want, namely that the replicants are not people. But as Tyrell noted, it took a great deal more questions to determine if Rachel was a replicant or not, which means that as the replicants get more and more advanced, the differences between they and human beings shrinks more and more. When you have to look this hard for the difference between man and machine, the difference is negligible, and that difference grows smaller by the passing days. To fully understand the issues that are raised in Blade Runner, we must explore the never-ending controversy between two schools of thought, monism and dualism. The monist believes that the mind and the brain are one. There is no distinction between the two, no ghost in the machine, if you will. We are our brains, and our brains are us. The dualist, on the other hand, believes that some immaterial something, separate from the physical brain, is present and acts to allow us to think, at least conceptually. Monism is pretty straightforward. It's just the physical, and that's it. The mind is reducible to matter. The mind is simply the result of the brain in action. Dualism, on the other hand, has had several different variations, some of which seem to be a bit strange. Thomas Aquinas believed that the mind and the brain were like that of a rower and the rowboat, two separate things working in concert with one another but not completely dependent on one another. Mortimer Adler suggested a more moderate form of dualism in which the mind is dependent on the brain, but that the brain is not the organ of thought the way the eye connected to the brain is the organ of vision. In both camps, difficulties arise, sometimes even just in the terms that they use. It is very difficult for even the most steadfast monist to speak of the mind and the brain in entirely monistic terms at all times and in all respects. To do so would be to make no distinction between the job of a psychologist and the job of a neurologist. Likewise, even the most steadfast dualist must concede, again at least to some degree, that the mind is dependent on the brain in some sense. In the case of brain damage, for example, where a normally thinking person is now impaired due to injury or some other physical malady. After all, if the mind is truly like the rower who can swim away after the boat has been sunk, why should he not be able to swim away after the boat has been damaged? And believe me, these objections only scratch the superficial surface of the controversies surrounding the issue known as the mind-body problem. Dualism is usually associated with Descartes, but its roots began long before him, back to the days of Plato and Aristotle, and it even predates them. Plato believed that there were actually two worlds, the world of the material and the world of ideas. And he took that a step further to even suggest that the world of ideas was actually more real than the world of the material. The material world changes and shifts so much that it's hard to say if a speck of sand is the same speck of sand now that it was 5 seconds ago. The world of ideas, on the other hand, always remains the same. A triangle is a triangle, forever and always. Aristotle scoffed at the notion of the world of ideas being more real than the physical world, but still insisted that some immaterial something must exist to give our ideas universality. He believed that there is some universal something that makes everything the thing that it is. For example, a triangle is a triangle, whether it is large, small, scalene, equilateral, red, blue, or polka dot. Whatever particular triangle we grasp with our minds, there is some universal triangle-ness that makes all particular triangles triangles. And since universals don't exist in the physical world, only particulars, an immaterial triangle-ness must exist that we grasp eventually through what he called induction. The response of the monist to all this is very simple. Universals don't exist at all. Everything we experience through the senses is particular, and since all human knowledge comes through sense perception, particulars are all we can grasp. David Hume in particular believed that he refuted the idea of universals once and for all with the following thought experiment. Try and think of a triangle in general, without any of the properties ascribed to any particular triangle, a triangle that is not of any size, shape, or color, but just a triangle as such. As soon as you try and do so, you should realize that you are talking nonsense when suggesting that there is any such thing. This is what became known as bundle theory, the theory that only the properties ascribed to a thing exist. There is no triangle as such in any of those properties. The dualist's response to this challenge should be obvious and is actually kind of funny. Yeah, we know. We know that the brain cannot apprehend universals. We know that you cannot think of a triangle as such. That's our point. Descartes came largely to the same conclusion as Plato and Aristotle about all this, but it wasn't due to a building on they or anyone else's ideas. Descartes, in fact, was such a vehement skeptic, so distrustful of any and all ideas that came before him, that he scrapped from his mind all schools of thought that preceded him and quite literally started from scratch. Descartes doubted everything that he could not be completely sure of in order to see if there was anything that he could not doubt. And eventually he was able to doubt every single thought except for one. He could not doubt that he was thinking. This led to the famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This, for Descartes, was the foundation of all other knowledge that we could have, and proof positive that at least our own minds exist. And if we are only deceived into believing that anything else exists, well, we still must exist because you cannot be deceived at all if you are nothing. In short, we as human beings can infer our own existence by knowing that we think. This is so important because the movie Blade Runner deals first and foremost with the only issue that will ever settle the dispute once and for all between monism and dualism. The issue of whether or not the immaterial acts in order for us to think. That of artificial intelligence. Even if another animal other than man were discovered to be able to think the way that we do, this debate would not change in the slightest. The same arguments and counter-arguments would still be present, just plus one more being. Dualism states that conceptual thought cannot be a product of the material. Therefore, if it were discovered that any other animal can think the way that we think, that argument would apply equally to them, at least as far as the dualist is concerned. There is still some immaterial something lurking behind the scenes to make the whole thing work. Only an artificial intelligence would settle this question once and for all. Here, there is no room for an immaterial argument. Or if there is, I can't really see how. We made the thing. We were responsible for every component built. We now know that the intellect must be the result of the material. To sum up, if something like a Blade Runner scenario were to actually happen in reality, it would make more of an impact on the way we think about ourselves and our place in the world than perhaps any other scientific or philosophical phenomenon, for the concept of dualism would be largely disproven forever. Today, science has become uniform and wide-reaching, being in the forefront of all that we know and trust, while philosophy has taken a downturn, most especially in this day and age. Very little agreement or even cooperation between different philosophical schools of thought, and no real uniform philosophical standard. Some modern philosophers have even changed the nature of philosophy to make it more like science and mathematics. Hell, some philosophers base all of their conclusions solely on science with virtually no philosophy whatsoever. Almost all of Dan Dennett books contain about 90% scientific lectures and about 10% real philosophy. As science is, among other things, the study of the physical and the material, and as it has become, in this day and age, the go-to subject for all of our answers, it should therefore come as no surprise that in modern times, monism reigns supreme. Nevertheless, the controversy rages on. The Turing test is also not without its own set of controversies, though that should come as no shock to anyone. There are even those in the field of computers and AI who have believed that they have already passed it. The chatterbot known as Lbot, for example, actually did convince 3 out of the 12 people judging it that it was in fact a human being. Although that finding isn't without its controversies either, you can actually talk with this thing yourself by going to lbot.com, although the only thing that site made me do was wonder how this chatterbot actually fooled anyone. Those who doubt even the validity of the test make some very good points. A person with Down syndrome probably couldn't pass that test at all, but we wouldn't take that to mean that they aren't human. For me, the Turing test is kind of like the justice system. It's not perfect, and it probably isn't going to infallibly make the right call every time, but I do think that it's the best test that we have. As for the Blade Runner film itself, it's something of an anomaly for me. Ordinarily, when I do a review of one of my favorite movies, I will typically review a film that I honestly believe have little to no flaws at all. That isn't the case with Blade Runner, not by a long shot. Plenty of people have complaints about this film, and for once, I don't entirely disagree with some of them. In all honesty, not much happened in the plot. Most of the characters demonstrated little personality or passion, and let's not forget the setting. I understand what Ridley Scott was trying to do with it, and I understand why it was so, but this is the most bleak, drab, generic setting of any science fiction film I've seen. It definitely does what it sets out to do, but it loses my interest in the process. However, my biggest problem with this film is, let's face it, the rape scene. I'm sorry, but there isn't any room to weasel out of this for me. This is a man who knows he is dealing with a scared and confused woman, and he specifically physically, takes advantage of her. There just isn't any way around that fact for me. There just isn't any way around the fact that Deckard is taking what he wants from a helpless woman. It's the one scene that very nearly made me hate the character, and made me feel that Rachel shouldn't be within 100 feet of this guy. Call me crazy, but I don't believe that there are any excuses for an act of rape. This is without a doubt the film's biggest mistake. A film that has little to nothing going on and no characters is usually a recipe for a movie that I would hate. And yet with all of these flaws, I still love this film. It is perhaps the only movie I have ever seen where almost all of its value lies not in the plot or the characters, but simply in the way the story is framed. The issues addressed in this film are addressed not by the things that are said or done in the film, but simply by the way the people in the film act. The replicants in the film are proven to be human by simply acting human, by passing every test that Descartes could ever have thrown at them without anyone even seeming to notice. For me, the issue of a truly thinking machine is kind of like the issue of time travel. I don't think it will ever happen, but I'm fascinated about what would happen if it did. I think Blade Runner may have given the most honest answer to that question. We have a hard enough time accepting all human beings as equals. Artificial beings would have a hard enough time just being recognized as anything but machines. And we, as human beings, would have an even harder time accepting our new place in the universe.